Most people reduce Caitlin Clark to spectacle. They see the logo threes, the deep pull-ups, the audacity to shoot from distances that feel more like statements than basketball decisions. They see the highlights looping across social media, shots that don't just fall, but land like proof that the rules don't apply to her. But that version of the story is comfortable,
clean,
marketable, and completely incomplete. Because behind the noise, behind the cameras, the endless debates, the pressure of an entire league bending in real time around one player, there was another conversation happening. Quiet, unrecorded, unfiltered. A conversation between two players separated by 4 decades, but connected by something far more dangerous than nostalgia. Larry Bird didn't sit down with Caitlin Clark to talk about shooting. He didn't break down mechanics. He didn't praise her range. He didn't care about highlights. He talked about survival. Not physical survival, the kind measured in injuries or minutes played, but psychological survival. The kind that decides whether a generational player becomes immortal or collapses under the very weight that made them famous. Because Bird recognized something immediately. Something most people watching from the outside couldn't see yet. Caitlin Clark wasn't just becoming great. She was becoming necessary. And that changes everything. To understand why Bird's words carried so much gravity, you have to understand the blueprint he lived through. When Bird entered the NBA, the league wasn't a global empire. It wasn't even stable. It was fading. Finals games weren't always live. Arenas weren't always full. The NBA wasn't competing for dominance. It was fighting for relevance. Then came Bird. And alongside him, Magic Johnson. Together, they didn't just elevate basketball, they rebuilt it. Every dollar the league makes today, every global broadcast, every sold-out arena traces back to the foundation they laid. Now fast forward.
different era,
Different league. Same structural problem. The WNBA had talent, elite talent, but it lacked a gravitational force strong enough to pull in the casual fan. It needed more than skill. It needed a shift. Caitlin Clark became that shift. Not gradually. Instantly. The numbers told a story that opinions couldn't argue with. When she stepped on the court, attention followed. When she stepped off, it disappeared. Entire viewership patterns rose and fell depending on her presence. That's not stardom. That's dependency. And Bird had lived that reality before anyone else could warn her about it. So when he spoke to her, he didn't talk like a fan. He didn't even talk like a mentor. He spoke like someone who had already seen the ending and was trying to change it. Because the real danger for players like them isn't failure. It's expectation. Expectation that doesn't just ask you to be great, but demands that you stay there. Every night, every possession, under every condition, with no room for fluctuation, no margin for humanity. And when that expectation becomes constant, it stops being motivation. It becomes pressure. Then pressure becomes weight. And weight, if it's not managed, becomes collapse. Bird didn't dress it up. He didn't soften it. He warned her. He told her about the part of greatness nobody celebrates. The part where every opponent isn't just trying to win, but trying to break you. Where every veteran sees your spotlight as something they were denied. Where every foul hits harder, every whistle feels later, every mistake gets amplified. He told her that the real battle isn't played on the scoreboard. It's played in the mind. And at that point in her career, Clark was losing that battle. Not because she wasn't talented, but because she was reacting. She argued calls, showed frustration, let the physicality and the noise pull her into emotional decisions. She wasn't just playing basketball, she was responding to everything around it. And that's exactly what her opponents wanted. Because once you pull a player like her out of her natural rhythm, you don't have to outplay her. You just have to outlast her. Bird saw it instantly because he had been that exact player once. Then he gave her something that sounded simple, but was actually brutal in its discipline. Don't beat them with your mouth. Beat them with their own expectations. He told her that every reaction is a loss. Every complaint. Every visible frustration. Every moment spent arguing instead of executing. It all feeds the opposition. Because they're not trying to stop her talent. They're trying to disturb her control. And the moment she loses control, even for a second, she's playing their game. A game she should never be playing. Bird explained something deeper, something almost unsettling in its clarity. Great players aren't loud. They're silent. Not because they lack emotion, but because they weaponize it. He reminded her how he operated. How he faced opponents who wanted to provoke him, challenge him, get inside his head. And instead of responding, he did something far more devastating. He ignored them and destroyed them. Not theatrically. Not emotionally. Efficiently. He let the scoreboard speak. And when the scoreboard speaks, it doesn't argue. It ends conversations. That idea changed everything. Because what happened next wasn't just improvement. It was transformation. Clark didn't suddenly become more skilled. She was already one of the most skilled players on the planet. What changed was how she applied it. She stopped chasing moments. She started controlling outcomes. The difference sounds subtle, but in basketball, it's massive. Before, she would take the shot people expected. The logo three. The highlight attempt. The kind of play that electrifies a crowd but destabilizes consistency. After, she began manipulating the game itself. She moved the ball faster, made decisions earlier, controlled spacing instead of reacting to it. She started playing one step ahead, not just of defenders, but of the entire structure of the defense. 2 seconds, faster decisions. That's all it took. 2 seconds. Insignificant in life, but eternal in basketball. The difference between a double team arriving and never forming. The difference between chaos and control. And suddenly, something terrifying happened. She became quieter. Not less impactful, more. Not less dominant, more. But the dominance looked different. It wasn't forced. It wasn't loud. It was inevitable. The kind of inevitability that doesn't need validation. The kind that doesn't argue. The kind that simply happens over and over again until resistance feels pointless. That's what Bird saw in her. Not just talent. Not just potential. But the ability to reach that level of control. Because in the end, the real message wasn't about basketball at all. It was about identity. About understanding that when the world builds you into something larger than the game, you have 2 choices. You can perform for it, or you can control it. Most players perform. Very few control. Bird was one of them. And now he was asking Caitlin Clark to become one too. Not louder. Not flashier. But colder.
Smarter.
Untouchable in a way that doesn't show up in highlights, but shows up everywhere else. And that's the part most people still don't see. The shots were never the story. The range was never the story. The real story is what happens when a player stops trying to prove they're great and starts acting like they already know. It starts with a shift so subtle most people miss it. The difference between a contested shot and a wide-open teammate. The difference between reacting to a defense and dismantling it before it even forms. That's where Caitlin Clark changed. Not louder. Not flashier. More dangerous. At first, defenses thought they had solved her. Blitz her early. Trap her high. Crowd her before she can even think about launching from 30 feet. Force the ball out of her hands and make someone else beat you. It worked briefly. Because early on, Clark tried to fight it. She split double teams that weren't meant to be split. She took shots over pressure that were designed to bait her into mistakes. She played into the trap instead of around it. And that's exactly what the league wanted. Until it stopped working, the adjustment didn't look dramatic. It looked simple. The moment she crossed half-court pass. Not a safe pass. Not a delayed read. A surgical strike. A hit ahead to the corner the instant the second defender committed. A perfectly timed delivery into space before the defense could even rotate. A decision made before the trap fully existed. And just like that, the entire defensive strategy collapsed. Because now, trapping her wasn't pressure. It was a mistake. Teams that once swarmed her at the timeline suddenly hesitated. Hesitation in basketball is death. Because now every defender faced a new problem. If you leave your assignment, she punishes you instantly. If you stay home, she walks into rhythm. There was no correct answer anymore. That's when the comparisons to Larry Bird stopped sounding like hype and started sounding like diagnosis. Bird didn't dominate defenses by outrunning them. He dominated them by controlling them. He could stand still and still bend the floor. pull defenders out of position without touching the ball, force mistakes before the play even began. And suddenly, Clark was doing the same thing. Not by trying to beat the double team, but by turning the double team into a weapon. The ripple effect was immediate. Aliyah Boston became unstoppable in the paint, not because she changed, but because the game around her did. Passing lanes that had been clogged all season suddenly opened like doors swinging wide at exactly the right moment. Clark wasn't just passing the ball. She was delivering it on time, on target, and on purpose, to the exact spot Boston needed it, at the exact second the defense was weakest. That's not playmaking. That's orchestration. And it didn't stop there. Kelsey Mitchell started seeing cleaner looks, real space, not forced attempts. Sophie Cunningham became a perimeter threat defenses couldn't cheat off anymore. Lexi Hull found herself wide open not by accident, but by design, because when two defenders are locked onto one player, the rest of the floor doesn't just open, it transforms. This is what Bird recognized immediately. Not just talent. Vision. The kind of vision that can actually become a problem. Because early in his career, Bird had the same issue. He was seeing plays that didn't exist yet. Throwing passes to spots his teammates hadn't reached. Operating at a speed nobody else was ready for. It made him brilliant. It also made things chaotic. So, he taught Clark something that sounds simple but is almost impossible to master. Make the complex look attainable. Keep the full game in your head, but deliver it to your teammates at a speed they can handle. Don't slow down your mind. Control how it shows up. And that's when everything changed again. Clark stopped playing against offenses. She started playing with the fabric of the game itself. Angles became tools. Timing became leverage. Pace became a weapon. She wasn't chasing highlights anymore. She was controlling reality. But what Bird said next, that's what shook the league. Publicly, he didn't hold back. He didn't call her a star. He didn't call her a future great. He called her something far more disruptive, a franchise. To most people, that sounds like praise. To the league, it sounded like a warning. Because when Bird entered the NBA, he didn't just join the league. He changed its economics. Alongside Magic Johnson, he turned a struggling product into a global machine. Television deals exploded. Arenas filled. The entire business model shifted. And now, Bird was saying the same thing was happening again. With Clark. He pointed out what nobody wanted to say out loud. The numbers weren't subtle. When she played, interest surged. When she didn't, it dropped hard. That's not influence. That's structural importance. And Bird knew exactly what that meant, because he had carried that same weight before anyone else. Then came the line that hit like a controlled explosion across the basketball world. When I came in, the veterans hated me too, until they realized I was the reason their paychecks were going to double. That wasn't just a reflection. It was an indictment of every player who targeted Clark, of every voice that dismissed her impact, of every system that treated her like a problem instead of an opportunity. He called her a rising tide. And rising tides don't ask for permission. They lift everything, or they expose what refuses to rise. But the most important thing he told her he didn't say publicly. That part stayed between them. And it changed how she saw herself completely. You're not just a player. You're the CEO of the league's future. That shift is subtle on paper. In reality, it's seismic. Because once you stop seeing yourself as someone trying to fit into a system, you start realizing the system is adjusting to you. Clark stopped trying to be accepted. Stopped managing her fame. It begins with control. Because once Caitlin Clark mastered the obvious, the passes, the reads, the tempo, something deeper started to emerge. Something far more difficult to defend, and far more dangerous than scoring. Predictability disappeared. At first, defenses still tried to convince themselves they had answers. Switch everything. Blitz selectively. Force her left. Push her off the logo. Adjustments layered on adjustments, like patches on a system that was already failing underneath. But Clark wasn't reacting to those adjustments anymore.
She was anticipating them.
That's the moment a great player becomes something else entirely. Because reacting keeps you in the same timeline as everyone else. Anticipating moves you ahead of it. And when you're ahead of the timeline, you're not just playing faster. You're playing alone. This is where the game starts to look unfair. Not because of athleticism, not because of strength, but because of clarity. Clark began seeing the decision tree of every possession before it even started. She wasn't waiting to see what the defense would do. She already knew what it had to do. And once you know what something has to do, you control it. Defenders started arriving at the right spots, at the wrong time. Rotations were technically correct, but practically useless. Because she had already moved the ball, already shifted the angle, already created the advantage before the defense even realized it existed. This is the part of basketball that doesn't translate to highlights. There's no slow motion replay for anticipation. No stat for manipulating space before it forms. No metric for bending 5 defenders without touching them. But it's the part that separates stars from systems. And that's what Clark was becoming. A system. Larry Bird used to talk about this in a way that confused people at the time. He'd describe games not as sequences of plays, but as patterns. If you see the pattern early enough, he believed, the rest of the game becomes predictable. Clark didn't just understand that idea. She applied it. Now, every possession carried a quiet inevitability. If you pressed her, she'd punish the space behind you. If you sagged, she'd step into rhythm. If you doubled, someone else was already open. If you hesitated, she took everything. No wasted motion. No unnecessary drama. Just decisions that felt pre-written. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for the rest of the league. Because when a player reaches this level, the conversation shifts from how do we stop her to something far more difficult. What happens if we can't? That realization started creeping in slowly. Not in headlines. Not in viral clips. But in body language. Defenders who used to press her started backing off half a step. Rotations came a fraction slower. Closeouts felt more cautious than aggressive. And that fraction, that hesitation is everything, because hesitation is where control transfers. And Clark was taking it. Possession by possession. Game by game. But the real shift wasn't just happening on the court. It was happening in how she carried herself within the ecosystem of the league. Before, there was tension. An unspoken friction between a rising star and an established structure.
Questions about respect.
About hierarchy. About whether she had earned her place. That tension didn't disappear. It became irrelevant. Because once performance reaches a certain level, debates lose power. Arguments require uncertainty. And Clark was removing uncertainty. Larry Bird understood this better than anyone. He knew that respect in professional sports doesn't come from negotiation. It comes from inevitability. You don't convince people you belong. You make it impossible for them to argue otherwise. That's exactly what was happening. Quietly, relentlessly, Clark stopped engaging with narratives, stopped responding to criticism, stopped participating in the emotional economy that surrounds professional athletes. Not because she didn't hear it, but because she no longer needed to. This is where the concept of silence evolves again. It's no longer just about ignoring opponents. It's about ignoring everything that doesn't directly impact the outcome. Media noise, social expectations, external validation. All of it becomes irrelevant. And when that happens, something rare takes place. Focus sharpens to a level that feels almost mechanical. Every possession becomes intentional. Every decision becomes calculated. Every movement serves a purpose. That's when the game slows down. Not physically, but mentally. To everyone else, the pace looks the same.
Fast.
Chaotic. Demanding. But to her, it's clear. Manageable.
Controlled.
That's the paradox of elite mastery. The higher the pressure, the calmer it feels. And this is where the rest of the league faces its most difficult challenge. Because you can scheme against skill. You can adjust to tendencies. You can prepare for patterns. But how do you defend control? How do you stop a player who isn't just reacting to what you do, but shaping what you're allowed to do? That question doesn't have a simple answer. And that's exactly why it's dangerous. Because once a player reaches this level, the game stops being about matchups. It becomes about influence. Clark's influence wasn't just affecting possessions anymore. It was affecting decisions. Coaches second-guessing schemes. Players hesitating on rotations. Entire systems adjusting, not proactively but reactively. And that's the ultimate shift. when the league starts reacting to you, instead of the other way around. This is the space Larry Bird once occupied. A space where performance becomes gravity, where presence alone alters outcomes, where the game isn't just played, it's dictated. And now, Caitlin Clark is stepping into that same space. Not identically, not historically, but structurally. Which brings us to the most unsettling